So hello, and welcome to our reading of the Life Divine. Tonight we enter the 11th chapter, The Boundaries of the Ignorance, which again is a revised chapter, not newly written, but substantially revised from its first publication in the Arya, the journal, back in February of 1917. All the citations here, which begin the chapter as we have it, differ from what he originally had in that February 1917 issue, because these are more descriptive of the nature of what he's talking about. The first is from the Katha Upanishad. It's not one of the older Upanishads, but still one which is precious to readers. It says, in English, "One who thinks there is this world, ayam loka, and no other." In other words, a consciousness that does not perceive behind the superficies of existence, which accepts nature as we commonly experience it and thinks this is all. This is the beginning and end of things. So the Upanishad suggests that there is something greater. The next citation is from the Rig Veda, the very source of India's great heritage. "Extended within the infinite, Ananta, headless, Ashirsha, and footless, Apad, concealing his two ends." The idea that there is this vastness, which it, even in ancient times, regards as an infinity, has no head. It is so expansive that it exceeds anything that we can ascribe to being above us in consciousness and being. And without a foot, because it extends so far beyond what we can reach with our consciousness. Concealing his two ends. So ends there may be, but our consciousness is not capable of apprehending what they are. And since we're talking here about the boundaries of the ignorance, you can see how these first two citations from the Katha Upanishad and from the Rig Veda describe above and below, around and within, we are encircled by our own ignorance. The next citation is from the oldest of the Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka. "He who has the knowledge, I am Brahman, becomes all this that is. Aham Brahmasmiti Saidam Sarvam Bhavati. But whoever worships another divinity than the one self and thinks, other is he, and I am other, he knows not." So it is finding identity with that comprehensive self, which is static behind, immovable, immortal, and yet moving in all that is outside. That is what is knowledge. If you have that, you know. If you don't have that, you don't know yet. The next is from the Mandukya Upanishad, and this is a condensation that Sri Aurobindo translates here. "This self is fourfold. The self of waking, Vaishvanara, who has the outer intelligence and enjoys external things, is its first part. The self of dream, Swapna, who has the inner intelligence and enjoys things subtle, is its second part. The self of sleep, sushupta, unified, amassed intelligence, blissful and enjoying bliss, is the third part. The Lord of all, Sarveshwara, the omniscient, the inner control, that which is unseen, indefinable, self-evident in its one selfhood, is the fourth part, Chaturtam. This is the self. This is that which has to be known. No single aspect describes all that the self is. The self is this waking, vibrant, sensible world. It is that conceptive consciousness which dreams all of this into existence, exemplifying, embodying what it conceives within. It is that blissful state of the Lord who in great superconscience surveys without partition all that plays within him. But finally, there is that fourth step, which is all and more, which cannot be quantified. So when we think of the syllable Om, it is composed of these four elements. The A representing the external world, the U representing the world of the conceptive consciousness, the M representing that superconscient sleep, where self and other dissolve into utter oneness. But what is that fourth state, which later is called Turiya, the fourth? Here it is called Chaturtam. That is the self which, like that drone sound when we say Om, that drone sound is there throughout all the enunciation of the other letters. That is the supreme reality, uniting all. All the states are part of a single reality. So that's the Mandukya Upanishad. The last, of course, is again from the Katha. He began with the Katha, he comes back to the Katha. A conscious being, no larger than a man's thumb, stands in the center of our self. Angushta Matra Purusha, the center of our self, Madhya Atmani. He is master, Isha, of the past and the present. He is today, and he is tomorrow. This is the nature of your real being. So this again is Veda and Vedanta, the ancient knowledge of the one who is everywhere, who is behind and above and within and yet outside all things, all beings, the all constituting the omnipresent reality. So now let's begin chapter 11, the boundaries of the ignorance. It is now possible to review in its larger lines this ignorance, or this separative knowledge laboring towards identical knowledge, which constitutes our human mentality, and in an obscurer form, all consciousness that has evolved below our level. So this is a survey which has brought us to this point where we can see all that evolution has yet achieved, from the misty beginnings below, up to what we are now. As we move from separative knowledge, where we are seeking to know and to become one with the object that we study, to identical knowledge, where we are one with that which we see, which, as Sri Aurobindo has pointed out in the last chapter, is the consummation of knowledge. That is knowledge. We see that in us it consists of a succession of waves of being and force. Sat, being, Shakti, force. Pressing from outside and rising from within, which become stuff of consciousness and formulate in a mental cognition and mentalized sensation of self and things in time and space. Time presents itself to us as a flow of dynamic movement, space as an objective field of contents for the experience of this imperfect and developing awareness. So time expresses the flow, and space is the field in which it occurs. This is a rather classical description of time and space. By immediate awareness, the mental being, mobile in time, lives perpetually in the present. By memory, he saves a certain part of his experience of self and things from streaming away from him entirely into the past. By thought and will and action, by mind energy, life energy, body energy, he utilizes it for what he becomes in the present and is yet to become hereafter. The force of being in him that has made him what he is works to prolong, develop, and amplify his becoming in the future. All this insecurely held material of self-expression and experience of things, this partial knowledge accumulated in the succession of time, is coordinated for him by perception, memory, intelligence, and will, to be utilized for an ever new or ever repeated becoming, and for the mental, vital, physical action which helps him to grow into what he is to be and to express what he already is. So, our immediate awareness of the present, our memory of things which we have captured from our experience before they elude us and fall into the past, and our capacity to act. So all of this goes into the mind's toolbox to establish what we are: memory, intelligence, and will. This composes the mental being. The present totality of all this experience of consciousness and output of energy is coordinated for relation to his being, gathered into consistency around an ego sense, which formulates the habit of response of self-experience to the contacts of nature in a persistent, limited field of conscious being. So this is how the ego sense begins to develop. It is this ego sense that gives a first basis of coherence to what otherwise might be a string or mass of floating impressions. All that is so sensed is referred to a corresponding artificial center of mental consciousness in the understanding, the ego idea. So there's an ego sense gathering all the data that comes in through our various senses, and then an ego idea, which in a sense represents the conscious marshalling of this data and perhaps analysis of it. This ego sense in the life stuff and this ego idea in the mind maintain a constructed symbol of self, the separative ego, which does duty for the hidden real self, the spirit or true being. So the ego does not exist only at one level. It exists in the mind, it exists in the vital nature, and by extension it exists in the physicality as well. But these represent us on the surface as a kind of separative self, which we call the ego. That becomes a symbol of our action in the world. It isn't our real self, which lies within. Our true being is inside. This is what he refers to as the hidden real self. And then there's ego, and then there's the gathering of all this stuff out there in the world. So you can see the layered being that we are. Are we aware of it? That's the question that Sri Aurobindo is asking. The surface mental individuality is, in consequence, always egocentric. Even its altruism is an enlargement of its ego. The ego is the linchpin invented to hold together the motion of our wheel of nature. We can underscore that and say, as long as we remain poised in our mental personality, we are necessarily egocentric. That is to say, the mind is capable of having this one perspective, this one fictional representation of self, which is centered here, so it's quite perspectival. Can't see all at once, but sees out from here. And this is a fiction. This is the ego point, the sense of separation in self from world, self from other. The necessity of centralization around the ego continues until there is no longer need of any such device or contrivance, because there has emerged the true self, the spiritual being, which is at once wheel and motion, and that which holds all together, the center and the circumference. An echo here of the Katha Upanishad. Stands in the center of ourself, master of the past and the present. He is today and he is tomorrow. But the moment we study ourselves, he writes, we find that the self-experience, which we thus coordinate and consciously utilize for life, is a small part even of our waking individual consciousness. We fasten only upon a very limited number of the mental sensations and perceptions of self and things which come up into our surface consciousness in our continual present. Of these, again, memory saves up only a scanty part from the oblivious gulf of the past. Of the storings of memory, our intelligence utilizes only a small portion for coordinated knowledge. Will utilizes a still smaller percentage for action. So here he's talking about our actual zone of awareness and how restricted it is. And again, using memory, intelligence, and will as references to the mind's toolbox. How we use this to construct sense of self. A narrow selection, a large rejection or reservation, a miserly spendthrift system of waste of material and unemployment of resources, and a scanty and disorderly modicum of useful spending and utilizable balance seems to be the method of nature in our conscious becoming, even as it is in the field of the material universe. Economics. But this is only an appearance, for it would be a wholly untrue account to say that all that is not thus saved up and utilized is destroyed, becomes null, and has passed away ineffectually and in vain. because clearly much is eluding our grasp. Does it go away? Is it lost? No. A great part of it has been quietly used by nature herself to form us, and actuates that sufficiently large mass of our growth and becoming and action for which our conscious memory, will, and intelligence are not responsible. So it's formed what is outside of our actual range of awareness. A still greater part is used by her as a store from which she draws and which she utilizes, while we ourselves have utterly forgotten the origin and provenance of this material, which we find ourselves employing with a deceptive sense of creation. For we imagine we are creating this new material of our work when we are only combining results out of that which we have forgotten, but nature in us has remembered. So again, we have the sense of creation when actually things are being constructed, maneuvered, manipulated by the conscious energy of nature. We become collaborators at some point, surely. But much of us has been constructed without our direct awareness, and much of what we think we do is engineered by a larger intelligence using a greater provenance. If we admit rebirth as part of her system, we shall realize that all experience has its use, for all experience counts in this prolonged building, and nothing is rejected except what has exhausted its utility and would be a burden on the future. This, of course, will bear greater scrutiny when we get to the section in the Life Divine which looks at the reality of our conscious being as it extends over eons, and what material is useful for our growth and what is not. A judgment from what appears now in our conscious surface is fallacious, for when we study and understand, we perceive that only a little of our action and growth in us is conscious. The bulk of it is carried on subconsciously, as in the rest of her material life. We are not only what we know of ourselves, but an immense more which we do not know. Our momentary personality is only a bubble on the ocean of our existence. And this is our personal existence he's speaking of here. Part of the world existence, part of the great being's existence. So here is another boundary of the ignorance. A superficial observation of our waking consciousness shows us that of a great part of our individual being and becoming, we are quite ignorant. It is to us the inconscient, just as much as the life of the plant, the metal, the earth, the elements. But if we carry our knowledge farther, pushing psychological experiment and observation beyond their normal bounds, we find how vast is the sphere of this supposed inconscient or this subconscient in our total existence. The subconscient, so seeming and so called by us because it is a concealed consciousness, and what a small and fragmentary portion of our being is covered by our waking self-awareness. So we think that everything of which we are not conscious is the inconscient. But immediately below our waking awareness is a subconscient existence, which we can begin to probe if we learn how to inquire into it, if we learn how to dive into its recesses, that can become conscious to us. And we can distinguish that from the greater and vaster inconscience which lies beneath that. The inconscience, as he has described, is the inversion of the superconscience. If there is a great light above, there is a great darkness below. But all light and dark exist within the one being, which is itself all light. So all darkness, in a sense, is a dark pretense, but real to us. It is the divine fallen into a swoon. It seems to be non-being, inconscient. But between that inconscience and our waking conscience is this whole realm of the subconscient. And of that, if we develop a greater psychology, we can come to know something of it. We must, if we are to become fully devoid of these boundaries of ignorance, if we're to throw them all off and know ourselves utterly and the world as it is, all of us as an expression of that, then these boundaries of the ignorance must not simply retire from us, but be raised. We arrive, he writes, at the knowledge that our waking mind and ego are only a superimposition upon a submerged, a subliminal self, for so that self appears to us, or more accurately, an inner being with a much vaster capacity of experience. Our mind and ego are like the crown and dome of a temple, jutting out from the waves, while the great body of the building is submerged under the surface of the waters. Of course, those of you who have been to Varanasi, Benares, have seen temples on the shore of the Ganges, Mata Ganga, Mother Ganges, which have been brought into the current of the river and are partly submerged. And all that lies below you can't see, but you can only see what is at the top. So he's described an inconscient, he's described a subconscient, but now he's referring again to what he's described in earlier chapters, a subliminal self which we can equate with our inner being, which is behind. It is not the subconscient, but it is the realm of our truer nature. So he continues, this concealed self and consciousness is our real or whole being, of which the outer is a part and a phenomenon, a selective formation for a surface use. This goes back to the idea that our momentary personality is just a bubble on the ocean of our existence. We're much more than we can imagine, much more than our surface self reveals to us. We can take from that we ought never to be discouraged by our current limitations because they do not define us. We are oceanic in being. We perceive only a small number of the contacts of things which impinge upon us. The inner being perceives all that enters or touches us and our environment. So in our direct awareness, most of it goes by. We're oblivious to it. But the inner being is aware. We perceive only a part of the workings of our life and being. The inner being perceives so much that we might almost suppose that nothing escapes its view. We remember only a small selection from our perceptions, and of these even we keep a great part in a storeroom where we cannot always lay our hand upon what we need. The inner being retains everything that it has ever received and has it always ready to hand. we can form into coordinated understanding and knowledge only so much of our perceptions and memories as our trained intelligence and mental capacity can grasp in their sense and appreciate in their relations. The intelligence of the inner being needs no training, but preserves the accurate form and relations of all its perceptions and memories. And, though this is a proposition which may be considered doubtful or difficult to concede in its fullness, can grasp immediately, when it does not possess already, their significance. And its perceptions are not confined, as are ordinarily those of the waking mind, to the scanty gleanings of the physical senses, but extend far beyond, and use, as telepathic phenomena of many kinds bear witness, a subtle sense, the limits of which are too wide to be easily fixed. So he's suggesting to us that a greater psychology, an expanded psychology, is available to us, and those inner powers which we might doubt with our skeptical surface mind can, when fully harnessed, expose us to their reality and convince us and convert us. The relations between the surface will or impulsion and the subliminal urge, mistakenly described as unconscious or subconscious, have not been properly studied, except in regard to unusual and unorganized manifestations and to certain morbidly abnormal phenomena of the diseased human mind. But if we pursue our observation far enough, we shall find that the cognition and will or impulsive force of the inner being really stand behind the whole conscious becoming. The latter represents only that part of its secret endeavor and achievement which rises successfully to the surface of our life. To know our inner being is the first step towards a real self-knowledge. So this expanded psychology, of course, he can refer to what was then current in the field of psychology, the efforts of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in their different ways to expand and define our understanding of the unconscious. But, of course, the development of Maslow's theories and Assagioli's philosophy and psychology, and later of transpersonal psychology, all lay in the future, so to that he cannot speak here. But the last point is the most important. To know our inner being is the first step towards a real self-knowledge. So there's an outer personality, there's an inner being, and then there's the true person inside, the psyche. So layer after layer we have to penetrate. Using the image of the last chapter, door after door we have to break through, barrier after barrier we have to get beyond, to know what we are and really to know the world. But first, let us know ourselves. If we undertake this self-discovery and enlarge our knowledge of the subliminal self, so conceiving it as to include in it our lower subconscient and upper superconscient ends, we shall discover that it is really this which provides the whole material of our apparent being, and that our perceptions, our memories, our effectuations of will and intelligence are only a selection from its perceptions, memories, activities, and relations of will and intelligence. Our very ego is only a minor and superficial formulation of its self-consciousness and self-experience. It is, as it were, the urgent sea out of which the waves of our conscious becoming arise. But what are its limits? How far does it extend? What is its fundamental nature? Ordinarily, we speak of a subconscious existence and include in this term all that is not on the waking surface. But the whole or the greater part of the inner or subliminal self can hardly be characterized by that epithet. For when we say subconscious, we think readily of an obscure unconsciousness or half-consciousness, or else a submerged consciousness below and in a way inferior to and less than our organized waking awareness, or at least less in possession of itself. But we find when we go within that somewhere in our subliminal part, though not coextensive with it since it has also obscure and ignorant regions, there is a consciousness much wider, more luminous, more in possession of itself and things than that which wakes upon our surface and is the percipient of our daily hours. That is our inner being, and it is this which we must regard as our subliminal self, and set apart the subconscient as an inferior, a lowest occult province of our nature. In the same way, there is a superconscient part of our total existence in which there is what we discover to be our highest self. And this, too, we can set apart as a higher occult province of our nature. So, he is distinguished between the subliminal inside and the subconscient below. The subliminal is the inner being, and we must see the subconscient as an inferior occlusion, not our true self. We must carefully see what we really are as being this subliminal being which does not lapse into the ignorance of the subconscient. But what then is the subconscient? And where does it begin? And how is it related to our surface being or to the subliminal of which it would seem more properly to be a province? Again, he's drawing a line between subliminal and subconscient. Where does it start? How does it come? We are aware of our body and know that we have a physical existence, even very largely identify ourselves with it. And yet, most of its operations are really subconscious to our mental being. Not only does the mind take no part in them, but, as we suppose, our most physical being has no awareness of its own hidden operations or by itself of its own existence. That's what we think. It knows, or rather feels, only so much of itself as is enlightened by mind sense and observable by intelligence. This is the mind wondering about the nature of physical consciousness. We are aware of a vitality working in this bodily form and structure, as in the plant or lower animal, a vital existence which is also for the most part subconscious to us, for we only observe some of its movements and reactions. We are partly aware of its operations, but not by any means of all or most of them, and rather of those which are abnormal than those which are normal. We don't notice. Its wants impress themselves more forcibly upon us than its satisfactions, its diseases and disorders than its health and its regular rhythm. Its death is more poignant to us than its life is vivid. We know as much of it as we can consciously observe and use, or as much as forces itself upon us by pain and pleasure and other sensations, or as a cause of nervous or physical reaction and disturbance, but no more. Accordingly, we suppose that this vital physical part of us also is not conscious of its own operations, or has only a suppressed consciousness, or no consciousness like the plant, or an inchoate consciousness like the incipient animal. It becomes conscious only so far as it is enlightened by mind and observable by intelligence. Now this again is the mind's view, both of the body's awareness and of the vitals awareness. This is mind looking down and saying, well, it's so dim and obscure down there, not much going on. It only becomes conscious if I lean and peer over and into it. He continues, this is an exaggeration and a confusion due to our identification of consciousness with mentality and mental awareness. Aha, so consciousness is not simply the belt of mental awareness. Mind identifies itself to a certain extent with the movements proper to physical life and body, and annexes them to its mentality, so that all consciousness seems to us to be mental. But if we draw back, if we separate the mind as witness from these parts of us, we can discover that life and body, even the most physical parts of life, have a consciousness of their own, a consciousness proper to an obscurer vital and to a bodily being, even such an elemental awareness as primitive animal forms may have, but in us, partly taken up by the mind, and to that extent mentalized. Note, if we draw back and separate the mind as witness, this again is that great insight that Kapila had in establishing the Sankhya philosophy, based on an inner experience. Draw back, pull back into the witness pose, become the Sakshi, become the real person, the Purusha, and observe nature, and you will see that there is active in all these levels different stages of being. Now for Sri Aurobindo, this means that we can perceive that consciousness is at play in all of these, not a mental consciousness. The Sakshi need not be merely the Manomaya Purusha, but can watch also the play of mind too, from a deeper poise. You might say deepest poise. So other parts have their own, if lower, awareness too, appropriate to their own stage of existence. Consciousness is not absent anywhere in the whole hierarchy of being, in all of nature. There is the play of consciousness, from the inconscient to the superconscient. Anyway, back to his argument. Yet it has not, in its independent motion, the mental awareness which we enjoy. If there is mind in it, it is mind involved and implicit in the body and in the physical life. There is no organized self-consciousness, but only a sense of action and reaction, movement, impulse and desire, need, necessary activities imposed by nature, hunger, instinct, pain, insensibility, and pleasure. Although thus inferior, it has this awareness obscure, limited, and automatic, but since it is less in possession of itself, void of what to us is the stamp of mentality, we may justly call it the submental, but not so justly the subconscious part of our being. Yes, below the mind, but not subconscious. For when we stand back from it, When we can separate our mind from its sensations, we perceive that this is a nervous and sensational and automatically dynamic mode of consciousness, a gradation of awareness different from the mind. It has its own separate reactions to contacts and is sensitive to them in its own power of feeling. It does not depend for that on the mind's perception and response. The true subconscious is other than this vital or physical substratum. It is the inconscient, vibrating on the borders of consciousness, sending up its motions to be changed into conscious stuff, swallowing into its depths impressions of past experience as seeds of unconscious habit, and returning them constantly but often chaotically to the surface consciousness, missioning upwards much futile or perilous stuff of which the origin is obscure to us, in dream, in mechanical repetitions of all kinds, in untraceable impulsions and motives, in mental, vital, physical perturbations and upheavals, in dumb automatic necessities of our obscurest parts of nature. So there on that borderline, the subconscious meets the inconscient, and that is the source. I think we have reached a point where we can put down the pause button and unpause it next time when we meet. So, halfway through this relatively short chapter. Next week we finish it. Tonight, though, we resume our reading of Savitri. Excuse me for just a moment. This is in Book 7, the Book of Yoga, Canto 2, the parable of the search for the soul. All the world's possibilities in man are waiting as the tree waits in its seed. His past lives in him. It drives his future's pace. His present's acts fashion his coming fate. The unborn gods hide in his house of life. The daemons of the unknown overshadow his mind, casting their dreams into live molds of thought, the molds in which his mind builds out its world. His mind creates around him its universe. All that has been renews in him its birth. All that can be is figured in his soul. Issuing in deeds, it scores on the roads of the world, obscure to the interpreting reason's guess, lines of the secret purpose of the gods. In strange directions runs the intricate plan. Held back from human foresight is their end, and the far intention of some ordering will, or the order of life's arbitrary chance, finds out its settled poise and fated hour. Our surface, watched in vain by reason's gaze, invaded by the impromptus of the unseen, helpless records the accidents of time, the involuntary turns and leaps of life. Only a little of us foresees its steps. Only a little has will and purposed pace. A vast subliminal is man's measureless part. The dim subconscient is his cavern base. Abolished vainly in the walks of time, our past lives still in our unconscious selves, and by the weight of its hidden influences is shaped our future's self-discovery. Thus, all is an inevitable chain, and yet a series seems of accidents. The unremembering hours repeat the old acts. Our dead past round our future's ankles clings, and drags back the new nature's glorious stride, or from its buried corpse old ghosts arise, old thoughts, old longings, dead passions live again, recur in sleep, or move the waking man to words that force the barrier of the lips, to deeds that suddenly start and o'erleap his head of reason and his guardian will. An old self lurks in the new self we are. Hardly we escape from what we once had been. In the dim gleam of habit's passages, in the subconscient's darkling corridors, all things are carried by the porter nerves, and nothing checked by subterranean mind. Unstudied by the guardians of the doors, and passed by a blind instinctive memory, the old gang dismissed, old cancelled passports serve. Nothing is wholly dead that once had lived. In dim tunnels of the world's being and in ours, the old rejected nature still survives. The corpses of its slain thoughts raise their heads and visit mind's nocturnal walks in sleep. Its stifled impulses breathe and move and rise. All keeps a phantom immortality. Irresistible are nature's sequences. The seeds of sins renounced sprout from hid soil. The evil cast from our hearts once more we face. Our dead selves come to slay our living soul. A portion of us lives in present time, a secret mass in dim inconscience groups. Out of the inconscient and subliminal arisen, we live in mind's uncertain light, and strive to know and master a dubious world whose purpose and meaning are hidden from our sight. Above us dwells a superconscient God, hidden in the mystery of his own light. Around us is a vast of ignorance, lit by an uncertain ray of human mind. Below us sleeps the inconscient, dark and mute. So, until next week, namaste, Jai Ma.